And this morning, we're starting a new series that we are going to be working through over the summer. And it was one we mentioned a little while ago because we needed your help with this message series because we're calling it "You Asked for It." So all of our messages over the next couple months through the summer are going to be based on submission requests that came from either this congregation or the congregation in Finland. And there's a really simple reason why we did that, because if you don't like any of these messages, then we could just pass the buck and say it's all your fault because you guys asked for it, right? So that was the main reason. But let me just, before we look at this week's submission, let me just mention a couple things about this. First of all, just thank you. We got a ton of requests come through, and we got more requests submitted than we have weeks and Sundays that we can cover all the things that came through. So just, I thought I'd mention a few things to keep in mind. First of all, if you submitted an idea for one of the messages and you don't hear it in Bob Cajun, double check the online services, because different pastors are going to be teaching different messages at both sites. So just because it's not preached here doesn't mean it might not be preached in Finland. So you can find it there. Also, the very last Sunday, Labor Day weekend, we're going to do a bit of a grab bag Sunday. So we're going to look at a number of the ones that we didn't think we could, we didn't cover during, give it a full message, but just give a sort of kind of work through a number of the little questions and topics we got. A couple of people gave us requests, but they were almost for a full sermon series rather than something we could handle just in one sermon. Like, for example, can you teach on the book of this and the name of the book? So again, those are great, but hard to cover. The other thing that I just would mention is some of the messages we might not choose is because we've actually spoken on some of those recently, and those videos are online and available. So again, if you didn't hear, you can ask us and we can probably give you the link to a message that was done recently on that topic. Well, let's look at this week's one that we're going to look at. And I like this one because I thought it was a good way to start off. And it was also a good follow-up to last week's message on Father's Day. Last week, we looked at specifically Proverbs chapter 4, and the idea of the importance of parents passing on wisdom to their kids, obviously being Father's Day specifically geared to dads. And this one I thought was a good follow-up, and this might be my favorite one in the way it was written and submitted. And it goes this way: why is it easier for people to believe in what the world says these days than in God's word? Society questions the Bible and its accuracy and authenticity, yet will believe wholeheartedly in corrupt world leaders, idolize athletes and actors. During newscasts, we see people that claim to be an eyewitness, and everyone believes them, even if they have no qualifications. Yet we constantly question the eyewitness accounts in the Bible and question the validity. And this is the part I like. I guess that is a couple questions. Have a great day. So I like that. That's a nice, kind. So hopefully everybody has a great day today. But probably I'm going to kind of reduce that down and put it this way. I think this may be a simple way of putting at it. Why do so many people trust the world and not the word? Maybe another way we can look at it is, why should we trust the word and not all the information we get from the world? Now, as much as I love this question, there is one slight problem with it. It does a bit of circular reasoning in it. It sort of assumes the premise. It's because the idea of it is why don't people just trust the word? Now, typically in a message, what we do is we open up the Bible and then we explain, this is what the Bible says about this thing. But there's a problem if we say the reason you should trust the word, and then I open up the Bible, is because the Bible says so. It's kind of similar to when we go to parents go to their kids and say, you need to do this, and they say, why? And you say, because I said so. But why? Because I said so, right? So if somebody doesn't validate the authority to begin with, then you're just using it to say it is just kind of going back and forth. So this is what I'm going to do this morning. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give some personal reasons and observations as to why I believe so many people are eager to listen to the world and discount the word, right? So why do we are so interested in what the world has to tell us? Secondly, I'm going to give reasons as to why I suggest some of those who may discount the Bible, who think it's not worth giving their attention to, but if they actually cared about wisdom and living a life of meaning and purpose and understanding how to make the most of this life that God has given us, it should inevitably at least lead back to the Bible. And then finally, we'll actually look what the Bible teaches and how it backs up its own claim. So first of all, why do people choose the world and all the information it has? And just before we jump into this, I want to, as I was thinking of this week, I was reminded of the first couple chapters of 2 Corinthians. Let me read the first few verses of chapter 2. This is Paul writing to this church in Corinth. Paul writes these words: "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but the wisdom of this age, of the rulers of this age who are coming, but not the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing." One of the reasons why I thought about this particular passage, just before this passage in chapter 1, Paul talks about the wisdom of the world versus what he literally calls the foolishness of God. Meaning that when we look at what Scripture says from a worldly perspective, it doesn't actually seem wise to us. It actually seems foolish. It seems counterintuitive, right? He actually calls it not just the strength of sort of what comes with worldly wisdom, but the weakness. Again, he talked about preaching just Jesus Christ crucified, right? Who ever thought, where's their wisdom in a crucified God, right? Gods are all about power, all about strength, right? That makes common sense. But he says, the Bible, often if you look at its wisdom, it goes counterintuitive of what we want to think and how we want to act. The other thing that Paul says, he goes, but this is what's going to last longer than the wisdom of this age. It's going to come to nothing, right? We're going to forget the different things that people say at this particular time. And again, we're 2,000 years later. We probably don't know a whole lot of what was being said by those Roman leaders at that time. But he also says this, and I think this is pretty fascinating. He says, I didn't come with you with superior wisdom. I didn't come with eloquence or persuasive words, right? He just said, I just came to you and told you straight. I didn't bring about any gimmicks. I didn't try to sell you anything. In fact, when Paul was started out in the church of Corinth, he worked on the side. He didn't want to take any money, so people didn't think that he was teaching and saying anything with ulterior motives, which were common at that time. Nothing fancy schmancy, just here it is. Take it or leave it, right? No gimmicks. And I think that might be one of the reasons why, and kind of keep that in the back of our mind of thinking of why we are so persuaded by the world. The other thing I'll just mention, I also thought of another passage this week, especially for this first part where I'm going to look at, was a few chapters on in chapter 7. And I always like this passage as a pastor especially. It's chapter 7. Paul is talking specifically about marriage, but the one thing I really appreciate, not just what he says about marriage, is because this is one of the chapters in the Bible where Paul is most honest, because he goes back and forth. He says, okay, what I'm saying now, this is of God, right? I got some authority, but now right over here, this is just me. This is my only opinion, but I think it's of God. I think he's behind this. And this is kind of where I am today. So this first little part, I'm going to just be very honest. This is not, I don't have Bible backing it up. This is just Pastor Jeff. So if you want to be offended by anything, this first part is the part you can take issue. So they're not I, this is I, not the Lord. But this is me trying to come up with that question of why are so many interested in what the world has to say? The first thing that I thought of, and this might be the most obvious one, is just what I'm going to call access and inundation, right? We are just live in a time and age where we are just absolutely overwhelmed, bombarded by all the information that comes across us, right? As soon as we turn on our television screens, as soon as we turn on our phones, turn on our computer screens, we are bombarded with messages. As soon as you walk out that door, you're going to see a ton of just billboard advertising you stuff, giving you bits and pieces of information. Now, it's funny when you think about it, really for much of the time history is not because there was too much of information, it was because there was too little information. For many, many centuries, people would grow up, they might grow up in a small rural community, and so the only information that they got would be from mom and dad, maybe aunts and uncles, a couple of key elders in that time, and they had to just kind of go with what they had. I remember just in my where I used to live before we moved here, just about a block away was just one of those beautiful little one-room schoolhouses. And in fact, at the church congregation, we still had two teachers that used to teach in that one-room schoolhouse. Some of you people, I think some people in that were here in our first service said they remember going and attending school in a one-room schoolhouse. Right? So the only information you got was from that one particular teacher, regardless of what grade you are. You had this limited access. Today, if we want any information, we just pick up our phone and say, hey Siri, hey Alexa, hey Google, and we got the information that we need. The issue is not just, really whether we're going to get the world or choose it or not. It's just we can't avoid it whether we want it or not. We're overwhelmed with it. But I think one of the same principles is the same as at stake. Last week, when we looked specifically at Proverbs chapter 4, the writer says this: the first thing to know about wisdom is that you need to know and to go and get it, right? It just doesn't just fall from the sky, it doesn't fall on the lap, it doesn't just grow on trees. It's something that needs to be sought out and searched after, right? In those days, they probably had to go and maybe there's some other information I need to get other than just from mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or whatever. Whereas in us, it's like we need to find the wisdom to help us sort us through and make sense of all the bombardment of information that is being thrown at us. So that's the first thing is just we just are overwhelmed with information. Even if we wanted to avoid the world's wisdom or ideas, we can't, right? Unless we, live ourselves, become hermits and live in a cave somewhere. The second one, this is a little bit more cynical, but it's just this idea of follow the money, right? We all know that famous expression. And sometimes it's a good thing just to keep in the back of our mind that I do think there is a spiritual element behind this. And I think one of the most sort of spiritual elements is the spiritual power of influence, of prosperity, of all those different things. And we're somewhat naive if just all the information we come across is just completely neutral, right? There is so much competing for our eyeballs, for our clicks, right? They're gearing things in a way to get our attention, right? Sensationalism sells, right? Have you ever found this idea of just you're maybe on like a web news page and you go in there and you just scroll through the articles, and there's always those ones that just I have no business clicking on this, but I'm going to click just based on the title. And it's 10 reasons why, 7 reasons this, and all that, and they're always just hyperbolic, and they got us. But if we ever stop for a second and go like, really, why do I care what happening with Harry and Meghan? Like, what difference does that have in my life, right? And if we actually stopped and looked at all this information for a second, we might realize that so much that consumes us actually falls into those opening lines of Ecclesiastes. Remember, I love the King James when it says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, a chasing after the wind. More modern translations just say meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless, right? It's just vacuous. There's nothing there. There's no substance to it. Another thing that you might notice just in popular presentation today, that there is so much that always just kind of puts down everything in the past, right? The past is always terrible and the future is always going to be better. It's always going to be better than what is. Now, it doesn't mean that the past was perfect. It obviously wasn't not. It doesn't mean that the present is perfect and the future is going to be perfect. But one of the things that we've got to keep in mind is if all of a sudden we give a notion that there might be some wisdom in the past, then that might take our eyeballs of what's being sold to us in the present, right? We got to pay attention. The other thing is when we think about all the information that is thrown at us, it's so easy to get it where it's actually takes effort, to pull this thing off the shelf, dust it off, and try to balance it with that. This one actually takes effort. It actually takes work. But here's the third part, and I think this is the most spiritual aspect of these ideas, is that one of the reasons why we love and we look to the world for so much of our wisdom, so much of our information, is because it often confirms to our already biased, right? One of the problems is we've got so much information coming to us, we can find information that already assumes what we already believe or want to believe. I came across this this quote, didn't know who it came from, but I learned it was from Madonna, that brilliant mind. And it said this: everyone is entitled to my opinion. Don't you love those people? I'm probably maybe one of those people, right? And you're in a room, it's like, I don't know what they think, but I'm going to find out by the end of the day what that person thinks. But even if you don't get to share your opinion, if you have an opinion and you don't want that opinion to be challenged, we live in a day where we can put ourselves in a bubble, put ourselves in a silo, put ourselves in an echo chamber, whatever you want to call it, which all we hear is just affirms what we already believe. Think about it this way. Again, if you are, lean to the left, there's news organizations and information organizations that are geared specifically to you, to tell you what you want to know, right? There's the New York Times, the Washington Post, Toronto Star, MSNBC, all those things. If you lean to the right, there's Rebel News and Fox News and Breitbart, right? If you think that Donald Trump is the Messiah reincarnate, the Messiah, there's going to be news pages that are going to just tell you that. If you think he's Hitler and the worst person that ever happened on the planet, he's the Antichrist, there's going to be groups that are going to share that. If you think climate change is the greatest threat and that the world's going to be destroyed in the next 10 years because fossil fuels, you're going to find sources that are going to show that to you. If you think it's all a conspiracy theory and there's nothing about it, you're going to find the information that already assumes what you want to believe. We can live in a world and never have to be challenged. But I think that's part of one of the realities of the sinful nature just of the human heart, right? This goes all the way back to the garden. This goes back to Genesis chapter 3. I love the name of the tree that was placed in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't think that's there by coincidence. And right, what did the serpent say? If you take it, then you will be like God yourself. And this reality is, and one of the reasons why we love the information world, especially in this day and age when we can get it to confirm everything we already believe about ourselves, it's like, I can eat of this tree, right? And this tree is always going to agree with me. I can be my own God who'd be able to decide what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. And one of the first things that we learn, and one of the reasons why it's difficult to pick up this book, is because right from the opening pages, it says, guess what? You might be wrong about some things. You have a selfish heart with selfish motivations. And until you understand and deal with that, then you're not going to be able to find any wisdom or navigate it at all. Right? It actually, right from the beginning, confronts us in our own biases, and it calls it sin. So that's part of the reason why I think why we're obsessed with the information that comes from the world. And one thing that I would say too about this question is kind of posed as an either or. And I think we got to be a little bit careful about that, because even if we said, well, I'm just going to trust the word, I'm just going to ignore the world, we can't, even if we wanted to, right? And we got to be careful that in some ways it is practical and there are helpful things. Much more of it is about navigating, right? Even we talk the old expression, even, a broken clock is right twice a day. Even the weather person can get it right every once in a while too. You never know, but there's lots of practical things there that are helpful. Maybe it's actually looking at both sides of the story, but it's also trying to figure out how to deal with the wisdom, how to sort through it all. This leads to the next thing. But if we prioritize wisdom, I actually think it will inevitably lead us to the word. In fact, I think our own sinful nature will kind of always be drawing us away from it. But if we are actually honest for a few moments, it actually should draw us to it. Why do I say that? Well, we all only have one life to live. We only have a select amount of years on planet Earth, whether we like it or not. And one of the questions, most days we don't want to deal with it, but every once in a while we have to ask ourselves, like, why are we here? Right? Is there something beyond this? Is there meaning to this world beyond this world? Is there an actual right and wrong? How do I make sense of this life? How do I make the most of this one life I have? And if we think about it honestly and objectively, and we try to figure out how do I navigate this life, there's only going to be two principles that should ultimately navigate it. Some of us, we just kind of go with our gut and figure it out by each day. But if we honestly stop for a second, I think there would be two choices in which we would make. The first one would be the idea of pleasure, right? It would be a pretty obvious choice, right? I only have one life, so I'm going to just live it up. And especially if there is nothing beyond this life and this is all I got, this is all there is. We call that hedonism. Well, like, why don't I just indulge so it's all about me, just, right? And we can say that's selfish, that's terrible, but there's a lot of wisdom to it. It makes a lot of sense, right? If this is all there is, then why not make the most of it? Live as selfishly as possible. But there's even a problem with that, even if we choose that road. So for example, just say, let me just pick my appetite. I'm going to just live by this gut, by the appetite of my stomach. And so whenever I see something that looks yummy, filled with sugar, I see that piece of cake, I'm just going to eat it, right? I see that, whatever it is, whatever I'm going to eat it, I'm going to smoke it, whatever it is, I'm just going to enjoy it. Pardon? Meat. Smoked meat. That's what I was talking about. Smoked meat. Yeah. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. But even if you just live by the appetite of your belly, now you can enjoy life in the moment pretty good. But if that's your only gearing signal, you're going to go, it's probably to be, 500 pounds by 25 years old and dealing with cardiac arrest, right? There's still issues that go in. That maybe life is about figuring out when to indulge in the pleasures and when to be disciplined in myself. When do I focus on myself? When do I focus on those that are around me? How do I make sense of all these things? So the other principle is wisdom. So then if you're saying, okay, well, how do I navigate this life and where do I go for wisdom? And again, that's what we looked at last week with Proverbs 4, just go and get it. It doesn't fall on your lap. It's worth pursuing. Remember, twice a number of years ago, I was listening to a radio broadcast and there was this fella and he just talked about Genesis 1 and he just said, this is the most silliest piece of writing that's ever been given, and just kind of dismissed it. Only idiots would ever believe and hold into anything like that. A couple of years ago, recently, I saw another popular television person. He had a kind of a panel and one of them was a Christian thinker, and this guy just leveled him and he just said, I can't believe so silly, giving any credence to this book that's filled with fairy tales and contradictions and all sorts of stuff. Why waste your time? It's, beneath any of us. And I remember listening to both of those times at that time, hearing those attacks, but immediately afterwards, I remember thinking, yeah, but within 50 years, nobody will even know your names. No one will remember what you have to say. You will be a footnote in history. In fact, one of the guys, I don't even remember his name now, but he said, they will be still poring over this book, right? The most minute, portion of Nahum or something like that. There will be still more people talking about it, preaching on it, and considering it, not just 50 years, but 1,000 years from now, rather than what you have to say. And so the question is, if we are thinking about this world, if we actually take wisdom serious, why would we go and look at the front pages of the newspaper, what are going to be different tomorrow, which are going to be different the next day after that, which is going to be the next day of that, or the horoscope, which again is going to be different the next day after that, than going to something that has already been tried, trusted, and true for thousands of years? Doesn't it make it, just to be honest, even if you disagree with it completely, doesn't that at least make sense to look at this one document that has changed the world more than anything remotely close? It's the most world-changing, most produced, most banned, most debated, most read book. Now it's the most downloaded book that also contains the teachings of the most influential teacher and person who ever lived on planet Earth. Why wouldn't we even start there, right? My shelves are filled with lots of people I disagree with from lots of old generations. And part of it is just, even if I disagree with them, I think, well, They've made an impact, so it's at least worth giving the time to see what they had to say. Why wouldn't you do that with the most important document that our planet even knows? Lastly, let's consider this. Consider the word as its own witness. This is where it says we should trust the Bible because the Bible tells us to trust it. But just consider for a moment its impact. Psalm 19 says this: "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them your servants warned, and keeping them there is great reward." Those words were written 3,000 years ago. But here's the amazing thing. Pretty much everybody that's here today is here because you actually believe that there's truth to those words, that there is something in this old ancient book that might have impact on our lives. And that's why you're here. And if you're not here for that reason, it's because somebody dragged you here who believes that, right? That's part of the reality. Just consider just the impact of this book, not just the book as a whole, but just even little portions. Can you fathom what our planet would look like if it wasn't for just something simple like the Ten Commandments, right? It's funny these days and age, and I remember hearing this, goes, well, it's actually not really, we shouldn't really pay attention. Yeah, we know the commandments are kind of big, pretty basis for Western civilization and all sorts, but it was really, the Code of Hammurabi that came before, a couple hundred years before, and it's based on that, and there's debate about that. Let's just give that credence for a second. We didn't even know about the Code of Hammurabi until 1901, right? Whether we like it or not, the establishment, even for our nomes and for our legal system, is based on just one chapter in the book of Exodus and repeated again in the book of Deuteronomy. Think about just the familiarity of certain passages of scripture like the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalms, and often used and recited at the most important moments of our lives, at christenings of babies, at weddings, and probably most normally at funerals. It's funny, one of the fellows who's known as the world's most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, about 20 years ago, he came up with a well-known bestseller called The God Delusion. And if you know anything about Richard Dawkins, he is always constantly attacking religion, constantly attacking the Bible. And in this book, The God Delusion, in which he attacks the Bible, as much as he says it's silly, we should get rid of it and religion for so many things, he also says, but we still need to have a place for the Bible and teach it in our schools, because whether we agree with it or not, it has had such an incredible cultural impact. So this book, this atheist who spends 300 pages tearing it down, all of a sudden near the end of his book puts 2.5 pages of just saying general expressions that we use in everyday life that just come from the Bible, that we wouldn't know otherwise. And even a couple years ago, when it was the 400th anniversary of the King James version of the Bible, he was chosen as one of the people to be one of the audio readers of it, right? It's kind of an irony, isn't it? But listen to just this. He puts over 200 different, just little simple biblical expressions that come from the Bible. Here are just a few of them, right? Fruitful and multiply, brother's keeper. I like these ones. Mark of Cain, patience of Job, wisdom of Solomon. Stranger in a strange land, eye for an eye, wolf in sheep's clothing, a law unto himself, apple of the eye, den of thieves, how the mighty have fallen, let us drink, for tomorrow we die, to reap the whirlwind. If you like John Steinbeck, his two most famous novels are Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden, Salt of the Earth, The Land of the Living. And again, it can go over and over again. Just think about how the Bible begins. It begins with the most recognized words in all of literature, maybe with the exception of Once Upon a Time. But it's these words: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Those words, right? Again, Jews, Christians, Muslims can differ all about that. but that's the starting point for the three great monotheistic faiths. And it says that all philosophy, all reason, and all rational also start with those words. Whether we accept it or reject it is the starting point of all philosophy, all reason, right? Again, the impact is immense. Think about its longevity. Isaiah 40 verse 8 says this, the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. Just here's a little quick show of hands. How many people here have a hard copy of the Bible, even if it's like a Gideon's New Testament somewhere in their home, somewhere, anywhere, okay? So pretty much most of them. If you don't and you want one, we can make sure you have a copy of one, okay? How many people have it downloaded on their phones? Okay, most of us. Now, here's another question. So the most recent parts of the New Testament are getting close to about 2,000 years ago. How many have other copies of 2,000-year-old books on their shelves? Couple, right? I'll give you a couple hints, like Homer, Iliad, Odyssey, got a couple of those. Plato's Republic, right? There's a few, right? There's a few, but notice there's not near as many hands on those. I'm kind of one of those weird people who've got lots of old books, but usually the reason why I have those old books is so I can help understand this old book, okay? That's partly behind it. How many, you go into every town across this nation, and there's a building like this one. In this town, there's about 7 where the seats have this book contained in it, and they all come to hear something from it. Right? There's book clubs that meet, but they're changing books all the time. We stay grounded in this book, right? There aren't any books that still have the impact, are still being sought after like this one. The Bible is by far the best selling book of all time. There's nothing even close. But what I find more interesting than it just being the most best-selling, most produced, most downloaded book of all time is that it is the most translated book of all time. Nothing even close comes close. There are over 3,300, and the Bible is available, portions of the Bible are available in over 3,350 languages. The New Testament is available in over 2,000 plus languages. The Old Testament is fully available in over 700 plus languages. The next closest book is The Little Prince at 380. But what is even more remarkable about this is not only does it have the most translations, is most of those language it's translated today, the reason that they have an alphabet and a written language themselves is because Christians put it in their own language. They did the translating work. They developed the language, the written language for those cultures. A lot of times you'll hear this idea that, if it wasn't for these Christian missionaries who came in and imposed the Bible, we wouldn't have had all these cultures they wouldn't have destroyed all these cultures that they went into. Actually, one of the most amazing things that they also don't tell you is we wouldn't have the history of so many of these cultures written down if missionaries didn't come there and develop a language for them to begin with, especially in the overwhelming modernization of the world. It's because of the Christian methods that we were able to give them this Bible to also contain and write down their own cultures and their own traditions and their own stories. Another thing what I think is really, really fascinating about this, not only is it the most translated, but it was the most reproduced document of our ancient world. When you think about that, right? We mentioned about, Plato's great works, right? This great philosopher. We could think of Homer, this great epic poet. You could think of Virgil. You could think of, the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, written, by these great Caesars, these great statesmen. But then all of a sudden, when we look at the New Testament documents, the ones that were written down and treasured and preserved the longest, there are a couple little biographical accounts of this nobody Jewish rabbi from the backwoods of the Roman Empire, and just personal translations of letters, correspondences from this guy named Paul between house churches, right? These little personal documents were preserved, rewritten, and passed along and held on to, right? It's like a letter to you and your grandpa, or, a letter document from the Bob Cajun site to the Finland site. And these are the ones that stood the weight of time more than even some of these great writings from some of these other great thinkers at that time. It's hard to get our brain around. But let me just add one final thing before we close. Consider the Bible's internal testimony. Let me give you one more passage of scripture. It's Deuteronomy 18, verse 21. It says, 21, 22, it says this: "You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord?" And there's the answer. If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him, right? Pretty simple test. If somebody says something and it comes true, it should be believable. If somebody says something and it doesn't come true, well, don't believe it, right? It's not good proof. I'm going to show you one more chart up here, graph, and you're like, thanks for that, Jeff. I can't read a thing. I forgot my microscope. Just want to mention really quickly, back about 200 years ago, there was a well-known scholar and historian, Anglican scholar and historian by the name of Alfred Edersheim. And when he was going through the Old Testament, he found 456 references, again, written hundreds of years in advance, that predicted Jesus Christ's first coming. About 100 years after Alfred Edersheim, there was a fellow by the name of J. Barton Payne. He looked himself, and he came with 574 references. Now, a lot of people have looked at these notes by Edersheim and Payne, and they're like, I can quibble with this, I can quibble with that. But even if you take them out, most people say, well, there's at least roughly 300 that are pretty solid ground. This is just about a quarter of them. That's about all I could fit. And again, one point you go, I can quibble with that one. I can go, okay, maybe that one. Okay, maybe that one, right? At some point over another, the actual evidence is overwhelming. The way what was written hundreds of years ago came true in Jesus Christ. So the question that we started with was, well, why do we trust the world instead of the Word? I think a simple answer is there's this sort of selfish notion of us that wants to trust what we already want to believe about ourselves. When we go to the Word, it actually has to take us away sort of by that, move us outside of that comfortable ground and understanding that God might know more than we do. It takes a little bit more effort. It will actually confront our biases and things like that. But I'm also going to say this, one of the reasons why it is so important to trust the wisdom of the Word over the world is it's because of the wisdom of the Word that helps us look and make sense of all the information that the world is sending to us. I had thought of another way, but even last night I was reminded of this quote by C.S. Lewis, and I thought I would put it up. I don't have it on the slide. But I love this line from C.S. Lewis. He said this: "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I can see everything else." Right? When we put the Word in order, not only does it give us incredible wisdom, but it helps us to make sense of all the wisdom, all the information, all the things that the world is throwing at us. Right? It's like the secret decoder ring that helps us decode everything else. It's the foundation. And my prayer is that it'll be the foundation of wisdom for your lives as well.